Hello, scholars. This is Mr. Myers. We're going to do lesson 4.6 on interest groups. As always, please take good structured notes. Today we'll be talking about the functions, strategies, and different types of interest groups, what PACs are, and then a little bit about campaign finance. Okay, so in lesson 4.4, we talked about political parties being these large groups that basically try to, influence and control government. There are other groups that try to do that as well, and those are called interest groups. So on its most simple level, an interest group is a group of people that share some kind of interest, and that interest could be financial, it could be professional, it could be societal, sociocultural, it could be lots of different things. Interest groups have three basic functions. One is to raise awareness on issues that its members care about. Another would be to represent the views of possibly disenfranchised people or people who may not normally have a voice. Sometimes interest groups are needed to advocate for those that don't control the levers of power. Another major thing that interest groups do is provide information to the government, and this is a really important one. They do that in a couple different ways. We'll talk about that in a second, but that information can be used to inform legislators who are not experts about healthcare or veterans affairs or environmental policy. These interest groups can help inform our legislators about those issues and make sure that they have responsible legislation that addresses those issues. And it's more than just providing information. There are times when interest groups will actually be involved in the legislation process. They'll actually be proposing bills to Congress, or they'll be looking at legislation and then offering suggestions on amendments or tweaks to that legislation to make it more amenable to, again, its members. And interest groups employ several different strategies in order to try and achieve their goals. One of them is by influencing elections through campaign contributions, through giving money. And this may sound like a bribe and may look like a bribe, but that's not exactly the case. But the basic idea is that interest group can provide campaign contributions, they can run ads, they can do other things to support candidates who might ultimately support their particular policy positions. So certainly providing money and giving campaign contributions is one way in which interest groups function. Another is by lobbying, and lobbying simply refers to trying to persuade legislators. Back in the day when the House and the Senate would adjourn, constituents and average citizens would be waiting in the lobby to meet them and say, hey, what about this? And I need you to work on that. And they would try to influence their representatives to do what they wanted to do. And that's where the term lobbying comes from. Lobbying also has somewhat kind of a negative connotation in the United States today, but lobbyists just simply provide information and they're kind of a critical part of the process. Now, to what degree do lobbyists have undue influence? And certainly that depends on your political persuasion and a couple other factors, but they are a critical part of the process. Another strategy is using litigation. Litigation refers to lawsuits. And so an interest group might sue the government or a private entity or whatever the case might be in order to try to force changes in regulations or changes in legislation. Lawsuits can be a really important tool in order to force government action. In terms of the different types of interest groups, the first one would be economic. These would be interest groups that usually are related to some kind of profession and professionals who are advocating for policies and positions that best serve, again, their constituents' needs. The four at the top here that you see, Americans for Prosperity, the National Restaurant Association, the National Association of Manufacturers, and the National Association of Realtors, are four of the largest economic-based interest groups. And I'll just give you a very specific example. So the National Restaurant Association might lobby to try to prevent raising a minimum wage because they feel like that would hurt their business owners. So that's just one kind of example. Now, I don't have any pictures up here of labor unions, but labor unions are also examples of interest groups that, usually function at an economic level, right? They're trying to advocate for like the opposite, raising minimum wage and things along those lines. Another type is a special interest or a particular, special cause. And this would be an interest group that has one particular, issue that they're latched onto. A really great example would be like Mothers Against Drunk Driving or the National Rifle Association, right? Those are both very specific interest groups that have one specific thing, gun rights when it comes to the NRA, preventing drunk driving when it comes to Mothers Against Drunk Driving. And the last type of interest group would be a public interest group, which is kind of an odd thing to say. But this is an interest group that is largely trying to advance, the common good. The League of Women Voters is a good example of this. And even though the name suggests that they're only interested in women voting, and I'd already mentioned this in a previous lecture, they're a famous nonpartisan group whose sole function and purpose is to promote democracy and encourage everyone to come out to the polls. So that would be an example of a special interest group that is working just for the public interest in general. The ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, might also kind of fit into that category. They're trying to promote and protect civil liberties across the board for all Americans. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about money and interest groups then. So a political action committee, sometimes shortened to a PAC, is the monetary arm of the interest groups. Virtually every interest group has a PAC. And the PACs used to have relatively strict rules associated with them. There were limitations on how much money can be donated to a PAC. Only members of that interest group could actually donate to the PAC. And of course, the PAC then would distribute money. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But in the last 10 years or so, there's been a series of Supreme Court cases. The most notable is Citizens United versus FEC, which basically have eroded some of the limitations on donations to political action committees. And in short, the main thing I would want you to have in your notes is in the last 10 years, there's been a flood of new money that is entering into political campaigns through interest groups and PACs because of Supreme Court decisions that have slowly but surely kind of chipped away at some of those prohibitions. The results of these Supreme Court decisions have basically carved out a new kind of category of PAC. So it used to be that all PACs were connected to an interest group. Now we have things called non-connected PACs, which are sometimes referred to as super PACs. And these super PACs are allowed to collect unlimited amounts of money. They don't have to disclose where it's coming from. And in terms of regulations on their spending, there's relatively few of them. They can spend pretty much unlimited amounts of money on whatever they want as long as it's informative advertising as opposed to a campaign ad. And basically all that means is that as long as they're not saying vote for so-and-so, they can pretty much run positive ads or negative ads about people and about issues. As long as they're not explicitly telling someone to vote or not vote and not making it about a campaign, they can spend pretty much at their will. This can be problematic in a couple different ways, but one of the most basic ones is that it allows a huge amount of money coming into the system without the transparency that I think most Americans would probably want to see. And if you remember from lesson 4.3, we referred to this as dark money. Okay, on to some kind of nuts and bolts regarding campaign finance. So in terms of individual contributions, you can give unlimited amounts of money to candidates in Missouri. So if you want to support a candidate for Missouri governor, you can spend as much money as you want. Now, it has to be disclosed, but it's unlimited. In terms of federal candidates, folks that are running for the U.S. Congress, the U.S. House and Senate, presidential candidates, and so on and so forth, you can spend up to $2,700. And remember, you have unlimited amounts of contributions you can give to super PACs who don't have to disclose where that money is coming from. Again, dark money. And while there are limits on the amount of money that you could donate to like a federal candidate, there's unlimited amounts of money that the campaigns can spend. So whether that's a state candidate or a federal candidate, they can spend as much money as they raise. And as you can see from the graphic on the right, there's quite a bit of it. This last election in 2020 was certainly the most expensive on record. More and more money seems to be entering into the system. Now, in terms of donation disclosures, federal candidates do have to disclose and say where their money came from. Political action committees do not have to disclose where they came their money from. But even for the federal candidates that do have to disclose it, sometimes that actually happens after the elections, which really doesn't, help the average voter kind of figure out where, the money is coming from that's being spent on these campaigns. Now, state and federal laws do require paid for by disclosures of the group name. So, at the end of an ad, it'll say paid for by such and such, but if it's, something nebulous like Americans for Prosperity or Americans for a Better Day or whatever the case might be, again, it doesn't really tell you a whole heck of a lot. It's kind of a loophole that you can drive a freight train through. Okay, as always, hope you took good notes, and please bring any questions to class.